Come on, stretch now. Come on, move it, Rock, move it.
Morning, Twitch. Good morning, Luca. Good morning, Sayu. Good morning, Sunguru. Thank you all for coming. This is going to take me just a minute to get this all going again. I am a little out of sorts. All right, I think we're there. I think we're there. Oh, you know what? I don't have voice mod running, do I? Nope. Okie dokie. Ads wrapping up.
Mark.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. This will be the last episode of Brave New World. We're going to wrap it up today. And it's also TwitchImp01's birthday. I'd like everyone to give him some birthday wishes. It's a good bean, always around. Does a lot for the community. He deserves all the praise we can give him. And 15 watch streak. Oh my god. I didn't even know I've streamed that many times. That's amazing, Twitch. Thank you. Shout. Even though we know you don't stream, you're just the number one mod in A. Alright. On to the book. Thank you all for being here. Happy birthday again, Twitch. Alright, chapter 13. Henry Foster loomed up through the twilight of the embryo store. Like to come to a feelie this evening? Lenina shook her head without speaking. Going out with someone else? It interested him to know which of his friends was being had by which other. Is it Benito? He questioned. She shook her head again. Henry detected the weariness in those purple eyes, the pallor beneath that glaze of lupus, the sadness at the corners of the unsmiling crimson mouth. You're not feeling ill, are you? He asked, a trifle anxiously, afraid that she might be suffering from one of the few remaining infectious diseases. Yet once more Lenina shook her head. Anyhow, you have to go see the doctor, said Henry. A doctor a day keeps the jim-jams away, he added heartily, driving home his hypnopedic adage with a clap on the shoulder. Perhaps you need a pregnancy substitute, he suggested, or else an extra strong VPS treatment. Sometimes, the standard passion surrogate isn't quite... Oh, for Ford's sake, said Lenina, breaking her stubborn silence. Shut up! She turned back to her neglected embryos. A VPS treatment, indeed. She would have laughed. She hadn't been on the point of crying, as though she hadn't got enough VP of her own. She sighed profoundly as she refilled her syringe. John, she murmured to herself. John. Then, my Ford. She wondered, have I given this one its sleeping sickness injection, or haven't I? She simply couldn't remember. In the end, she decided not to run the risk of letting it have a second dose and moved down the line to the next bottle. 22 years, 8 months, and 4 days from that moment, a promising young Alpha-Minus administrator at Mwanza was to die of trypanosomiasis, the first case for over half a century. Sighing, Lenina went on with her work. An hour later, in the changing room, Fanny was energetically protesting. But it's absurd that you let yourself get into a state like this. Simply absurd, she repeated. And what about a man, one man? But he's the one I want. As though there weren't millions of other men in the world. No, I don't want them. How can you know until you've tried? I have tried. But how many? Asked Fanny, shrugging her shoulders contemptuously. 1, 2, dozens. But, shaking her head, it wasn't any good, she added. Well, you must be severe, said Fanny sententiously. But it was obvious that her confidence in her own prescriptions had been shaken. Nothing can be achieved without perseverance. But meanwhile, don't think of him. I can't help it. Take Soma then. I do. Well, go on. But in the intervals, I still like him. I shall always like him. Well, if that's the case, said Fanny with decision, Why don't you just go and take him, whether he wants it or not? But if you knew how terribly queer he was, all the more reason for taking a firm line. It's all very well to say that. Don't stand any nonsense. Act. Fanny's voice was a trumpet. She might have been a YWFA lecturer giving an evening talk to adolescent beta minuses. Yes, act. At once. Do it now. I'd be scared, said Lenina. Well, you've only got to take half a gram of soma first, and now I'm going to have my bath. She marched off, trailing her towel. The bell rang, and the savage, who was impatiently hoping that Helmholtz would come that afternoon, for having last made up his mind to talk to Helmholtz about Lenina, he could not bear to postpone his confidence a moment longer, jumped up and ran to the door. I had a premonition it was you, Helmholtz, he shouted as he opened. On the threshold, in a white acetate satin sailor suit, and with a round white cap richly tilted over her left ear, stood Lenina. Oh, said the savage, as though someone had struck him with a heavy blow. Half a gram had been enough to make Lenina forget her fears and her embarrassments. Hello, John, she said, smiling, and walked past him into the room. Automatically, he closed the door and followed her. Lenina sat down. There was a long silence. You don't seem very glad to see me, John, she said at last. Not glad. The savage looked at her reproachfully, then suddenly fell on his knees before her and, taking Lenina's hand, reverently kissed it. Not glad. If only you knew, he whispered, and venturing to raise his eyes to her face. Admired Lenina, he went on. Indeed, the top of admiration, worth what's dearest in the world. She smiled at him with a luscious tenderness. Oh, you so perfect. She was leaning towards him with parted lips. So perfect and so peerless are created, nearer and nearer, of every creature's best, still nearer. The savage suddenly scrambled to his feet. That's why, he said, speaking with averted face, I wanted to do something first. I mean, to show I was worthy of you. Not that I could ever really be that, but at any rate to show I wasn't absolutely unworthy. I wanted to do something. Why should you think it necessary? Lenina began, but left the sentence unfinished. There was a note of irritation in her voice. When one has leant forward, nearer and nearer, with parted lips, only to find oneself, quite suddenly, as a clumsy oaf shambles to his feet, leaning towards nothing at all. Well, there's a reason, even with a half a gram of soma circulating in one's bloodstream, a genuine reason for annoyance. I need to blow my nose. Give me just a second. All right. At Malpais, the savage was incoherent and mumbling. You had to bring her the skin of a mountain lion. I mean, when you wanted to marry someone, or else a wolf. There aren't any lions in England, Lenina almost snapped. And even if there was, the savage added with sudden contemptuous resentment, people would kill them out of helicopters, I suppose, with poison gas or something. I wouldn't do that, Lenina. He squared his shoulders. He ventured to look at her and was met with a stare of annoyed incomprehension. Confused, I'll do anything, he went on, more and more incoherently. Anything you tell me. There be some sports are painful, but their labor delight in them sets off. That's what I feel. I mean, I'd sweep the floor if you wanted. But we've got vacuum cleaners here, said Lenina in bewilderment. It isn't necessary. No, of course it isn't necessary, but some kinds of baseness are nobly undergone. I'd like to undergo something nobly, don't you see? But if there are vacuum cleaners, that's not the point. And Epsilon semi-morons to work them, she went on. Well, really, why? Why? But for you, just to show that I... And what on earth vacuum cleaners have got to do with lions? To show you how much... Or lions with being glad to see me. She was getting more and more exasperated. How much I love you, Lenina, he brought out almost desperately. An emblem of the inner tide of startled elation, the blood rushed up into Lenina's cheeks. Oh, do you mean it, John? But I hadn't meant to say so, he cried the savage, clasping his hands in a kind of agony. Not until... Listen, Lenina, in Malpais, people get married. Get what? The irritation had begun to creep back into her voice. What was he talking about now? For always. They make a promise to live together for always. What a terrible idea, Lenina was genuinely shocked. Outliving beauty's outward, with a mind that doth renew swifter than blood decays. What? It's like that in Shakespeare, too. If thou dost break her virgin knot before all sanctimonious ceremonies may with full and holy rite. Oh, for Ford's sake, John, talk sense. I can't understand a word you say. First it's vacuum cleaners, then it's knots. You're driving me crazy. She jumped up, and as though afraid that she might run away from her physically, as well as with his mind, caught him by the wrist. Answer me this question. Do you really like me, or don't you? There was a moment's silence, and then, in a very low voice, I love you more than anything in the world, he said. Then why on earth didn't you say so? She cried, and so intense was her exasperation that she drove her sharp nails into the skin of his wrist. Instead of driveling away about knots and vacuum cleaners and lions and making me miserable for weeks and weeks. She released his hand and flung it angrily away from her. If I didn't like you so much, she said, I'd be furious with you. And suddenly her arms were round his neck. He felt her lips soft against his own, so deliciously soft, so warm and electric that inevitably he found himself thinking of the embraces in 3 weeks in a helicopter. Oh, the stereoscopic blonde, and the more than real blackamoor. Horror, horror, horror. He tried to disengage himself, but Lenina tightened her embrace. Why didn't you say so? She whispered, drawing back her face to look at him. Her eyes were tenderly reproachful. The murkiest den, the most opportune place, the voice of conscience thundered poetically. The strongest suggestion our worser the strongest suggestion our worser genius can shall never melt mine honor into lust. Never, never, he resolved. You silly boy, she was saying. I wanted you so much, and if you wanted me, why didn't you... But Lenina, he began protesting, and as she immediately untwined her arms, as she stepped away from him, he thought, for a moment, that she had taken his unspoken hint. But when she unbuckled her white patent cartridge belt and hung it carefully over the back of a chair, he began to suspect that he had been mistaken. Lenina, he repeated apprehensively. She put her hand to her neck and gave a long vertical pull. Her white sailor's blouse was ripped to the hem. Suspicion condensed into a too solid certainty. Lenina, what are you doing? Zip, zip. Her answer was wordless. She stepped out of her bell-bottomed trousers. Her zippy kmicknicks were a pale shell pink. The Arch Community songster's golden tea dangled at her breast. For those milk paps that through the window bars bore at men's eyes, the singing, thundering, magical words made her seem doubly dangerous, doubly alluring. Soft, but how piercing, boring and drilling into reason, tunneling through resolution. The strongest oaths are straw to the fire and the blood. Be more abstemious, or else. Zip. The rounded pinkness fell apart like a neatly divided apple. A wriggle of the arms, a lifting first of the right foot, and then the left. The zippy comicnics were lying lifeless and as though deflated on the floor. Still wearing her shoes and socks and her rakishly tilted round white cap, she advanced towards him. Darling, if only you'd said before. She held out her arms, but instead of also saying, darling, and holding out his arms, the savage retreated in terror, flapping its hands at her as though he were trying to scare away some intruding and dangerous animal. 4 steps backwards, and he was brought to bay against the wall. Sweet, said Lenina, laying her hands on his shoulders, pressed herself against him. Put your arms round me, she commanded. Hug me till you drug me, honey. She too had poetry at her command, knew words that sang and were spells and beat drums. Kiss me. She closed her eyes and let her voice sink to a sleepy murmur. Kiss me till I'm in a coma. Hug me, honey, snugly. The savage caught her by the wrists, tore her hands from his shoulders, thrust her roughly away at arm's length. Ow, you're hurting me, Oh! She was suddenly silent. Terror had made her forget the pain. Opening her eyes, she had seen his face. No, not his face. A ferocious stranger's, pale, distorted, twitching with some insane, inexplicable fury. Aghast. But what is it, John? She whispered. He did not answer, but only stared into her face with those mad eyes. The hands that held her wrist were trembling. He breathed deeply and irregularly. Faint, almost to imperceptibility, but appalling, she suddenly heard the grinding of his teeth. Excuse me a second. All right. What is it? She almost screamed. And as though awakened by her cry, he caught her by the shoulders and shook her. Whore! He shouted. Whore! Impudent strumpet! Oh, don't! She protested in a voice made grotesquely tremulous by his shaking. Whore! Please! Damned whore! A gram is better, she began. The savage pushed her away with such force that she staggered and fell. Go, he shouted, standing over her menacingly. Get out of my sight or I'll kill you. He clenched his fists. Lenina raised her arm to cover her face. No, please don't, John. Hurry up, quick. One arm raised, and following his every movement with a terrified eye, she scrambled to her feet and, still crouching, still covering her head, made a dash for the bathroom. The noise of that prodigious slap by which her departure was accelerated was like a pistol shot. Ow! Lenina bounded forward. Safely locked into the bathroom, she had leisure to take stock of her injuries. Standing with her back to the mirror, she twisted her head. Looking over her left shoulder, she could see the imprint of a hand standing out, distinct and crimson on the pearly flesh. Gingerly, she rubbed the wounded spot. Outside, in the other room, the savage was striding up and down, marching to the drums and music of magical words. The wren goes to it, and the small gilded fly does lecher in my sight. Maddeningly, they rumbled in his ears. The fichu nor the soiled horse goes to it with the more riotous appetite. Down from the waist they are centaurs, the women all above, but to the girdle do the gods inherit. Beneath is all the fiends. There's hell, there's darkness, there is the sulphurous pit, burning, scalding, stench, consumption. Fie, 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 pa, pa! Give me an ounce of civet, good apothecary, to sweeten my imagination. John? Ventured a small, ingratiating voice from the bathroom. John? Oh, thou weed, who are so lovely fair and smellst so sweet that the sense aches at thee, was this most goodly book made to write whore upon? Heaven stops the nose at it. But her perfume still hung about him. His jacket was white with the powder that had scented her velvety body. Impudent strumpet, impudent strumpet, impudent strumpet. The inexorable rhythm beat itself out. Impudent. John, do you think I might have my clothes? He picked up the bell-bottom trousers, the blouse, the zippy cami-nicks. Open, he ordered, kicking the door. No, I won't. The voice was frightened and defiant. Well, how do you expect me to give them to you? Push them through the ventilator over the door. He did what she suggested and returned to his uneasy pacing of the room. Impudent strumpet, impudent strumpet. The devil luxury with his fat rump and potato finger. John? He would not answer. Fat rump and potato finger. John. What is it? He said gruffly. I wonder if you'd mind giving me my Malthusian belt? Lenina sat, listening to the footsteps in the other room, wondering, as she listened, how long he was likely to go tramping up and down like that, whether she would have to wait until he left the flat, or if it would be safe, after allowing his madness a reasonable time to subside, to open the bathroom door and make a dash for it. She was interrupted in the midst of these uneasy speculations by the sound of the telephone. By the sound of the telephone bell ringing in the other room. Abruptly, the tramping ceased. She heard the voice of the savage parleying with silence. Hello? Yes. If I do not usurp myself, I am. Yes. Didn't you hear me say so? Mr. Savage speaking. What? Who's ill? Of course it interests me. But is it serious? Is she really bad? I'll go at once. Not in her rooms anymore. Where's she been taken? Oh my God, what's the address? 3 Park Lane, is that it? 3? Thanks. Lenina heard the click of the replaced receiver, then hurrying steps. A door slammed. There was silence. Was he really gone? With an infinity of precautions, she opened the door a quarter of an inch, peeped through the crack, was encouraged by the view of emptiness, opened a little further, and then put her whole head out, finally tiptoed into the room, stood for a few seconds with strongly beating heart, listening, then darted to the front door, opened, slipped through, slammed, ran. It was not till she was in the lift and actually dropping down the well that she began to feel herself secure. All right, that's chapter 13. Thanks again for stopping by. Oh, shit. I just realized I forgot. I never got around to doing that stretch that Luca redeemed. Like, here we go. Oh. Oh, bouncing off the mic. Oops. All right, chapter 14. The Park Lane Hospital for the Dying was a 60-story tower of primrose tiles. As the Savage stepped out of his taxicopter, a convoy of gaily colored aerial hearses rose whirring from the roof and darted away across the park, westward, bound for the Slough Crematorium. At the lift gates, the presiding porter gave him the information he required, and he dropped down to Ward 81, a galloping senility ward, the porter explained, on the 17th floor. It was a large room, bright with sunshine and yellow paint, and containing 20 beds, all occupied. Linda was dying in company, and with all the modern conveniences. The air was continuously alive with gay synthetic melodies. At the foot of every bed, confronting its moribund occupant, was a television box. Television was left on, a running tap, from morning till night. Every quarter of an hour, the prevailing perfume of the room was automatically changed. "We try," explained the nurse, who had taken charge of the Savage at the door. "We try to create a thoroughly pleasant atmosphere here, something between a first-class hotel and a Feely Palace, if you take my meaning." "Where is she?" asked the Savage, ignoring these polite explanations. The nurse was offended. "You are in a hurry," she said. "Is there any hope?" he asked. "You mean of her not dying?" He nodded. "No, of course there isn't. When somebody's sent here, there's no—" Startled by the expression of distress on his pale face, she suddenly broke off. "Why, whatever is the matter?" she asked. She was not accustomed to this kind of thing in visitors. Not that there were many visitors, anyhow. Or any reason why there should be many visitors. "You're not feeling ill, are you?" He shook his head. "She's my mother," he said in a scarcely audible voice. The nurse glanced at him with startled, horrified eyes, then quickly looked away. From throat to temple, she was all one hot blush. "Take me to her," said the Savage, making an effort to speak in an ordinary tone. Still blushing, she led the way down the ward. Faces still fresh and unwithered, for senility galloped so hard that it had no time to age the cheeks. Only the heart and brain turned as they passed. The progress was followed by the blank, incurious eyes of second infancy. The Savage shuddered as he looked. Linda was lying in the last of the long row of beds, next to the wall. Propped up on pillows, she was watching the semi-finals of the South American Riemann Surface Tennis Championship, which were being played in silent and diminished reproduction on the screen of the television box at the foot of the bed. Hither and thither across their square of illuminated glass, the little figures noiselessly darted, like fish in an aquarium. The silent but agitated inhabitants of another world. Linda looked on, vaguely and incomprehendingly smiling. Her pale, bloated face wore an expression of imbecile happiness. Every now and then her eyelids closed, and for a few seconds she seemed to be dozing. Then, with a little start, she would wake up again. Wake up to the aquarium antics of the tennis champions, to the Supervox Wurlitz Arena rendering to the Supervox rendering of Hug Me Till You Drug Me Honey, to the warm draft of verbena that came blowing through the ventilator above her head. Would wake to these things, or rather to a dream of which of these things, transformed and embellished by the soma in her blood, were the marvelous constituents, the smile once more her broken and discolored smile of infantile contentment. "Well, I must go," said the nurse. I've got my batch of children coming. Besides, there's number 3. She pointed up the ward. "Might go off any minute now. Well, make yourself comfortable." She walked briskly away. The Savage sat down beside the bed. "Linda?" he whispered, taking her hand. At the sound of her name, she turned. Her vague eyes brightened with recognition. She squeezed his hand. She smiled. Her lips moved. But quite suddenly, her head fell forward. She was asleep. He sat watching her, seeking through the tired flesh, seeking and finding that young, bright face which had stooped over his childhood in Malpays, remembering, and he closed his eyes, her voice, her movements, all the events of their life together. Streptocock G de Banbury T. How beautiful her singing had been. And those childish rhymes, how magically strange and mysterious. ABC and vitamin D, fats in the liver, the cod's in the sea. He felt the hot tears welling up behind his eyelids as he recalled the words and Linda's voice as she repeated them. And then the reading lessons. The tot is in the pot, the cat is on the mat, and elementary instructions for beta workers in the embryo store. And long evenings by the fire, or in summertime, on the roof of the little house, when she told him those stories about the other place, outside the reservation, that beautiful, beautiful other place, whose memory, as of a heaven, a paradise of goodness and loveliness, she still kept whole and intact, undefiled by contact with the reality of this real London, these actual civilized men and women. A sudden noise of shrill voices made him open his eyes, and after hastily brushing away the tears, looked round. What seemed an interminable stream of identical 8-year-old male twins was pouring into the room. Twin after twin after twin they came, a nightmare. Their faces, their repeated face, for there was only one between the lot of them, puggishly stared, all nostrils and pale, goggling eyes. Their uniform was khaki. All their mouths hung open. Squealing and chattering, they entered. In a moment, it seemed, the ward was maggoty with them. They swarmed between the beds, clambered over, crawled under, peeped into the television boxes, made faces at the patients. Linda, astonished and rather alarmed them. A group stood clustered at the front of her bed, staring with the frightened and stupid curiosity of animals suddenly confronted by the unknown. "Oh, look, look," they spoke in low, scared voices. "Whatever is the matter with her? Why is she so fat?" They had never seen a face like hers before. Never seen a face that was not youthful and taut-skinned, a body that had ceased to be slim and upright. All these moribund sexagenarians had the appearance of childish girls. At 44, Linda seemed, by contrast, a monster of flaccid and distorted senility. "Isn't she awful?" came the whispering comments. "Look at her teeth." Suddenly, from under the bed, a pug-faced twin popped up between John's chair and the wall and began peering into Linda's sleeping face. "I say," he began, but the sentence ended prematurely in a squeal. The savage had seized him by the collar, lifted him clear over the chair, and with a smart box on the ears, sent him howling away. His yells brought the head nurse hurrying to the rescue. "What have you been doing to him?" she demanded fiercely. "I won't have you striking the children." "Well then, keep them away from this bed." The savage's voice was trembling with indignation. "What are these filthy little brats doing here at all? It's disgraceful." "Disgraceful? But what do you mean? They're being death-conditioned. And I tell you," she warned him truculently, "if I have any more of your interference with their conditioning, I'll send for the porters and have you thrown out." The savage rose to his feet and took a couple steps towards her. His movements and the expression on his face were so menacing that the nurse fell back in terror. With a great effort, he checked himself, and without speaking, turned away and sat down again by the bed. Reassured, but with a dignity that was a trifle shrill and uncertain. "I've warned you," said the nurse. Oop, that was not her voice. "I've warned you," said the nurse, "so mind." Still, she led the two inquisitive twins away and made them join in the game of Hunt the Zipper, which had been organized by one of her colleagues at the other end of the room. "Run along now and have your cup of caffeine solution, dear," she said to the other nurse. The exercise of authority restored her confidence, made her feel better. "Now, children," she called. Linda had stirred uneasily, had opened her eyes for a moment, looked vaguely around, and then once more dropped off to sleep. Sitting beside her, the savage tried to recapture his mood of a few minutes before. ABC, vitamin D, he repeated to himself, as though the words were a spell that would restore the dead past to life. But the spell was ineffective. Obstinately, the beautiful memories refused to rise. There was only a hateful resurrection of jealousies and ugliness and miseries. Pope with the blood trickling down from his cut shoulder, and Linda hideously asleep, and the flies buzzing round the spilt mezcal on the floor beside the bed, the boys calling those names as she passed. Ah, no, no. He shut his eyes, he shook his head in strenuous denial of these memories. ABC and vitamin D. He tried to think of those times when he sat on her knees and she put her arms around him and sang, over and over again, rocking him to sleep. ABC, vitamin D, vitamin D, vitamin D. The Supervox Wurlitzeriana had risen to a sobbing crescendo, and suddenly the verbena gave place, in the sense-circulating system, to an intense patchouli. Linda stirred, woke up, stared for a few seconds bewilderingly at the semi-finalists, then, lifting her face, sniffed once or twice at the newly perfumed air and suddenly smiled, a smile of childish ecstasy. "Pope," she murmured, and closed her eyes. "Oh, I do so like it. I do." She sighed and let herself sink back into the pillows. "But Linda," the savage spoke imploringly, "don't you know me?" He had tried so hard, had done his very best. Why wouldn't she allow him to forget? He squeezed her limp hand almost with violence, as though he would force her to come back from this dream of ignoble pleasures, from these base and hateful memories, back into the present, back into reality. The appalling present, the awful reality, but sublime, but significant, but desperately important, precisely because of the imminence of that which made them so fearful. "Don't you know me, Linda?" He felt the faint answering pressure of her hand. The tears started into his eyes. He bent over her and kissed her. Her lips moved. "Pope," she whispered again, and it was as though he had had a pailful of hors d'oeuvre poured. It was as though he had had a pailful of hors d'oeuvre thrown in his face. Anger suddenly boiled up in him. Balked for the second time, the passion of his grief had found another outlet, was transformed into a passion of agonized rage. "But I'm John," he shouted. "I'm John!" And in his furious misery, he actually caught her by the shoulder and shook her. Linda's eyes fluttered open. She saw him, knew him. "John!" But situated the real face, the real and violent hands, in an imaginary world, among the inward and private equivalents of patchouli and the Superwurlitzer, among the transfigured memories and the strangely transposed sensations that constitute the universe of her dream. She knew him for John, her son, but fancied him an intruder into that paradisal Malpays where she had been spending her summer holiday with Pope. He was angry because she liked Pope. He was shaking her because Pope was there in the bed, as though there were something wrong, as though all civilized people didn't do the same. "Everyone belongs to everyone." Her voice suddenly died into an almost inaudible, breathless croaking. Her mouth fell open. She made a desperate effort to fill her lungs with air, but it was as though she had forgotten how to breathe. She tried to cry out, but no sound came. Only the terror of her staring eyes revealed that she was suffering. Her hands went to her throat, then clawed at the air she could no longer breathe, the air that for her had ceased to exist. The savage was on his feet, bent over her. "What is it, Linda? What is it?" His voice was imploring. It was as though he were begging to be reassured. The look she gave him was charged with an unspeakable terror. With terror, and, it seemed to him, reproach. She tried to raise herself in bed, but fell back onto the pillows. Her face was horribly distorted, her lips blue. The savage turned and ran up the ward. "Quick! Quick!" he shouted. "Quick!" Standing in the center of a ring of zipper-hunting twins, the head nurse looked round. The first moment's astonishment gave place almost instantly to disapproval. "Don't shout. Think of the little ones," she said, frowning. "You might decondition." "What are you doing?" He had broken through the ring. "Be careful," a child was yelling. "Quick, quick!" He caught her by the sleeve, dragged her after him. "Quick, something's happening. I've killed her." By the time they were back at the end of the ward, Linda was dead. The savage stood for a moment in frozen silence, then fell on his knees beside the bed, and covering his face with his hands, sobbed uncontrollably. The nurse stood irresolute, looking now at the kneeling figure by the bed, the scandalous exhibition, and now, poor children, at the twins who had stopped their hunting of the zipper and were staring from the other end of the ward, staring with all their eyes and nostrils at the shocking scene that had been enacted round bed 20. Should she speak to him? Try to bring him back to a sense of decency? Remind him of where he was, of what fatal mischief he might do to these poor innocents, undoing all their wholesome death conditioning with his disgusting outcry, as though death were something terrible, as though anyone mattered as much as all that? It might give them the most disastrous idea about the subject, might upset them into reaching into the entirely wrong, the utterly antisocial way. Might upset them into reacting in the entirely wrong, the utterly antisocial way. She stepped forward. She touched him on the shoulder. "Can't you behave?" she said in a low, angry voice, but looking around, she saw that half a dozen twins were already on their feet and advancing down the ward. The circle was disintegrating. In another moment, no, the risk was too great. The whole group might be put back 6 or 7 months in its conditioning. She hurried back towards her menaced charges. "Now, who wants a chocolate eclair?" she asked in a loud, cheerful tone. "Me!" yelled the Bokanovsky group in chorus. Bed 20 was completely forgotten. "Oh, God, God, God," the savage kept repeating to himself. In the chaos of grief and remorse that filled his mind, it was the one articulate word. "God." He whispered it aloud. "God." "Whatever is he saying?" said a voice, very near, distinct and shrill through the warblings of the Superwurlitzer. The savage violently started, and, uncovering his face, looked round. 5 khaki twins, each with the stump of a long eclair in his right hand, and their identical faces variously smeared with liquid chocolate, were standing in a row, goggling at him. They met his eyes and simultaneously grinned. One of them pointed with his eclair butt. "Is she dead?" he asked. The savage stared at them for a moment in silence. Then in silence he rose to his feet. In silence, slowly walked towards the door. "Is she dead?" repeated the inquisitive twin, trotting at his side. The savage looked down at him and, still without speaking, pushed him away. The twin fell on the floor and at once began to howl. The savage did not even look round. All right, Chapter 15. The menial stuff of the Park Lane Hospital for the Dying consisted of 162 deltas divided into 2 Bokanovsky groups, of 84 red-headed female and 78 dark dolichocephalic male twins, respectively. At 6, when their working day was over, The two groups assembled in the vestibule of the hospital and were served by the deputy sub-bursar with their soma ration. From the lift, the savage stepped out into the midst of them, but his mind was elsewhere, with death, with his grief and his remorse. Mechanically, without consciousness of what he was doing, he began to shoulder his way through the crowd. "Who are you pushing? Where do you think you're going?" Oh, excuse me. High, low, from a multitude of separate throats, only two voices squeaked or growled, repeated indefinitely, as though by a train of mirrors. Two faces, one a hairless and freckled moon halo, moon haloed in orange, the other a thin, beaked bird mask, stubbly with two days' beard, turned angrily towards him. Their words and, in his ribs, the sharp nudging of elbows broke through his unawareness. He woke once more to external reality, looked around him, knew what he saw, knew it with a sinking sense of horror and disgust, for the recurrent delirium of his days and nights, the nightmare of swarming, indistinguishable sameness. Twins, like maggots they had swarmed, defiling over the mystery of Linda's death. Maggots again, but larger, full-grown. They now crawled across his grief and his repentance. Halted, and with bewilderment and horrified eyes, stared round him at the khaki mob, in the midst of which, overtopping it by a full head, he stood. "How many goodly creatures are there here?" The singing words mocked him derisively. "How beauteous mankind is, O brave new world!" Soma distribution, shouted a loud voice. "In good order, please. Hurry up there." A door had been opened, a table and chair carried into the vestibule. The voice was that of a jaunty young alpha, who had entered carrying a black iron cash box. Thank you for the hydrate, Twitch. I'm gonna have to refill that in a minute. Door's been opened, a table and chair. A jaunty young alpha who had entered carrying a black iron cash box. A murmur of satisfaction went up from the expectant twins. They forgot all about the savage. Their attention was now focused on the black cash box, which the young man had placed on the table and was now in process of unlocking. The lid was lifted. "Ooh, oh," said all the 162 simultaneously, as though they were looking at fireworks. The young man took out a handful of tiny pillboxes. "Now," he said peremptorily, "step forward, please, one at a time, and no shoving." One at a time, with no shoving, the twins stepped forward. First 2 males, then a female, then another male, then 3 females, then... The savage stood looking on. "O brave new world, O brave new world." In his mind, the singing words seemed to change their tone. They had mocked him through his misery and remorse, mocked him with how hideous a note of cynical derision. Fiendishly laughing, they had insisted on the low squalor, the nauseous ugliness of the nightmare. Now, suddenly, they trumpeted a call to arms. "O brave new world." Miranda was proclaiming the possibility of loveliness, the possibility of transforming even the nightmare into something fine and noble. "O brave new world" was a challenge, a command. "No shoving there now," shouted the deputy sub-bursar in a fury. He slammed down the lid of the cash box. "I shall stop the distribution unless I have good behavior." The deltas muttered, jostled one another a little, and then were still. The threat had been effective. Deprivation of soma. Appalling thought. "That's better," said the young man, and reopened his cash box. Give me just a second. I am going to go fetch up some more water. I will be right back. And we're 6 minutes out from the ad. I'm just going to go ahead and run that now. We'll do the 3-minute ad. I'm going to get some water, clear out a little bit, and I'll be back in a few minutes. All right. Well, so how's everyone's morning? It hasn't been a very chatty stream. Never really is. But, well, I got the ad going. I think most of the people here are probably subbed. So if you can hear this, whatever. But, how was your Christmas? How was everything? Excited for the new year. Hopefully, got some stuff cooking. I got a couple of visual novels on deck for January. Silly Bit got me Fate Stay Night, the remastered edition to read. And then I also picked up 3 games out of the Vampire the Masquerade series on a suggestion from someone else. So some visual novels in January. I'm going to do 1984 once we're done with this one. I'm going to start that on Sunday. Yeah. Plans within plans. Finally getting some stuff going. I'm going to hopefully have some structured time over the next month or so. Getting used to scheduling stuff, getting used to streaming more often. So hopefully there'll be a lot more coming sooner more than later. Let's see, where was I at? Stop the distribution. Everything's good. Okay. No shoving there, shouted the deputy sub-bursar in a fury. He slammed down the lid of his cash box. I shall stop the distribution unless I have good behavior. The deltas muttered, jostled one another a little, and then were still. The threat had been effective. Deprivation of soma, appalling thought. That's better, said the young man, and reopened his cash box. Linda had been a slave. Linda had died. Others should live in freedom, and the world be made beautiful. A reparation, a duty, and suddenly it was luminously clear to the savage that he must do it. It was as though a shutter had been opened, a curtain drawn back. Now, said the deputy sub-bursar. Another khaki female stepped forward. Stop, called the savage in a loud and ringing voice. Stop. He pushed his way to the table. The deltas stared at him with astonishment. Ford, said the deputy sub-bursar below his breath. It's the savage. He felt scared. Listen, I beg of you, cried the savage earnestly. Lend me your ears. He had never spoken in public before and found it very difficult to express what he wanted to say. Don't take that horrible stuff. It's poison. It's poison. I say, Mr. Savage, said the deputy sub-bursar, smiling propitiatingly. That's a new one. I haven't seen that in a while. Propitiatingly. Would you mind letting me? Poison to soul as well as body. Yes, but let me get on with my distribution, won't you? There's a good fellow. With the cautious tenderness of one who strokes a notoriously vicious animal, he patted the savage's arms. He patted the savage's arm. Just let me... Never, cried the savage. But look here, old man. Throw it all away, that horrible poison. The words, throw it all away, pierced through the enfolding layers of incomprehension to the quick of the delta's consciousness. An angry murmur went up from the crowd. I come to bring you freedom, said the savage, turning back towards the twins. The deputy sub-bursar heard no more. He had slipped out of the vestibule and was looking up a number in the telephone book. Not in his own rooms, Bernard summed. But not in mine, not in yours, not at the Aphroditeum, not at the center or the college. Where can he have got to? Helmholtz shrugged his shoulders. They had come back from their work expecting to find the savage waiting for them at one or other of the usual meeting places, but there was no sign of the fellow. which was annoying, as they had meant to nip across to Biarritz in Helmholtz's four-seater sporticopter. They'd be late for dinner if he didn't come soon. "We'll give him 5 more minutes," said Helmholtz. "If he doesn't turn up by then, we'll—" The ringing of the telephone bell interrupted him. He picked up the receiver. "Hello? Speaking." And then, after a long interval of listening, "Ford and Flivver," he swore. "I'll come at once." What is it?" Bernard asked. "Fellow I know at the Park Lane Hospital," said Helmholtz. "The savage is there. Seems to have gone mad. Anyhow, it's urgent. Will you come with me?" Together they hurried along the corridor to the lifts. "But do you like being slaves?" the savage was saying as they entered the hospital. His face was flushed, his eyes bright with ardor and indignation. "Do you like being babies?" "Yes, babies, mewling and puking," he added, exasperated by their bestial stupidity, into throwing insults at those he had come to save. The insults bounced off their carapace of thick stupidity. They stared at him with a blank expression of dull and sullen resentment in their eyes. "Yes, puking," he fairly shouted. Grief and remorse, compassion and duty, all were forgotten now, and, as it were, absorbed into an intense, overpowering hatred of these less-than-human monsters. "Don't you want to be free and men? Don't you even understand what manhood and freedom are?" Rage was making him fluent. The words came easily, in a rush. "Don't you?" he repeated, but got no answer to his question. "Very well, then," he went on grimly. "I'll teach you. I'll make you be free whether you want it or not." And pushing open a window that looked onto the inner court of the hospital, he began to throw the little pillboxes of Soma tablets in handfuls out into the area. For a moment, the khaki mob was silent, petrified at the spectacle of this wanton sacrilege, with amazement and horror. "He's mad," whispered Bernard, staring with wide-open eyes. "They'll kill him. They'll—" A great shout suddenly went up from the mob. A wave of movement drove it menacingly towards the savage. "Ford, help him," said Bernard, and averted his eyes. "Ford helps those who help themselves." And with a laugh, actually a laugh of exultation, Helmholtz Watson pushed his way through the crowd. "Free! Free!" the savage shouted, and with one hand continued to throw the Soma into the area, while with the other he punched the indistinguishable faces of his assailants. "Free!" And suddenly there was Helmholtz at his side. Good old Helmholtz, also punching. Men at last. And in the interval, also throwing the poison out by handfuls through the open window. "Yes, men! Men!" And there was no poison left. He picked up the cash box and showed them its black emptiness. "You're free!" Howling, the Deltas charged with a redoubled fury. Hesitant on the fringes of the battle. "They're done for," said Bernard, and, urged by a sudden impulse, ran forward to help them, then thought better of it and halted. Then, ashamed, stepped forward again, then again thought better of it, and was standing in an agony of humiliated indecision, thinking that they might be killed if he didn't help them, and that he might be killed if he did. When, Ford be praised, goggle-eyed and swine-snouted in their gas masks, in ran the police. Bernard dashed to meet them. He waved his arms, and it was action. He was doing something. He shouted, "Help!" several times, more and more loudly as to give himself the illusion of helping. "Help! Help! Help!" The policemen pushed him out of the way and got on with their work. 3 men with spraying machines buckled to their shoulders pumped thick clouds of Soma vapor into the air. 2 more were busy round the portable synthetic music box, carrying water pistols charged with a powerful anesthetic. 4 others had pushed their way into the crowd and were methodically laying out, squirt by squirt, the more ferocious of the fighters. "Quick! Quick!" yelled Bernard. "They'll be killed if you don't hurry. Oh!" Annoyed by his chatter, one of the policemen had given him a shot from his water pistol. Bernard stood for a second or two, wobbling unsteadily on his legs that seemed to have lost their bones, their tendons, their muscles, to become mere sticks of jelly, and at last not even jelly, water. He tumbled in a heap on the floor. Suddenly, from out of the synthetic music box, a voice began to speak, the voice of reason, the voice of good feeling. The soundtrack roll was unwinding itself in synthetic anti-riot speech number 2, medium strength, straight from the depths of a non-existent heart. My friends, said the voice so pathetically, with a note of such infinitely tender reproach, that behind their gas masks even the policemen's eyes were momentarily dimmed with tears. What is the meaning of this? Why aren't you all being happy and good together? Happy and good, the voice repeated. At peace, it trembled, sank into a whisper, and momentarily expired. Oh, I do want you to be happy, it began, with a yearning earnestness. I do so want you to be good. Please be good, and... 2 minutes later, the voice and the soma vapor had produced their effect. In tears, the Deltas were kissing and hugging one another, half a dozen twins at a time in a comprehensive embrace. Even Helmholtz and the Savage were almost crying. A fresh supply of pillboxes was brought in from the bursary. A new distribution was hastily made. To the sound of the voices' richly affectionate baritone valedictions, the twins dispersed, blubbering as though their hearts would break. Goodbye, my dearest friends. Ford keep you. Goodbye, my dearest friends. Ford keep you. Goodbye, my dearest. When the last of the Deltas had gone, the policeman switched off the current. The angelic voice fell silent. Will you come quietly? Asked the sergeant, or must we anesthetize? He pointed his water pistol menacingly. Oh, we'll come quietly, the Savage answered, dabbing alternately a cut lip, a scratched neck, and a bitten left hand. Still keeping his handkerchief to his bleeding nose, Helmholtz nodded in confirmation. Awake and having recovered the use of his legs, Bernard had chosen this moment to move as inconspicuously as he could towards the door. Hi, you there, called the sergeant, and a swine-masked policeman hurried across the room and laid a hand on the young man's shoulder. Bernard turned with an expression of indignant innocence. Escaping? He hadn't dreamed of such a thing. Though what on earth you want me, What the hell? Though what on earth you want me for, he said to the sergeant, I really can't imagine. You're a friend of the prisoners, aren't you? Well, said Bernard, and hesitated. No, he really couldn't deny it. Why shouldn't I be? He asked. Come on, then, said the sergeant, and led the way towards the door and the waiting police car. All right. Chapter 16. The room into which the three were ushered was the controller's study. His Fordship will be down in a moment. The Gamma butler left them to themselves. Helmholtz laughed aloud. It's more like a caffeine solution party than a trial, he said, and let himself fall into the most luxurious of the pneumatic armchairs. Cheer up, Bernard, he added, catching sight of his friend's green, unhappy face. But Bernard would not be cheered. Without answering, without even looking at Helmholtz, he went and sat down on the most uncomfortable chair in the room, carefully chosen in the obscure hope of somehow deprecating the wrath of the higher powers. The Savage, meanwhile, wandered restlessly around the room, peering with a vague, superficial inquisitiveness at the books in the shelves, at the soundtrack rolls and reading machine bobbins in their numbered pigeonholes. On the table under the window lay a massive volume, bound in limp black leather surrogate and stamped with large golden T's. He picked it up and opened it. My Life and Work, by R. Ford. The book had been published at Detroit by the Society for the Propagation of Fortean Knowledge. Idly he turned the pages, read a sentence here, a paragraph there, and had just come to the conclusion that the book didn't interest him when the door opened. and the resident world controller for Western Europe walked briskly into the room. Mustafa Mond shook hands with all three of them, but it was to the Savage that he addressed himself. "So you don't much like civilization, Mr. Savage," he said. The Savage looked at him. He had been prepared to lie, to bluster, to remain sullenly unresponsive, but reassured by the good-humored intelligence of the controller's face, he decided to tell the truth, straightforwardly. "No," he shook his head. Bernard started and looked horrified. What would the controller think? To be labeled as the friend of a man who said he didn't like civilization. Said it openly, and of all people, to the controller. It was terrible. "But John," he began. A look from Mustafa Mond reduced him to an abject silence. "Of course," the Savage went on to admit. "There are some very nice things, all that music in the air, for instance. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about my ears, and sometimes voices." Savage's face lit up with a sudden pleasure. "Have you read it too?" he asked. "I thought nobody knew about the book here in England." "Almost nobody. I'm one of the very few. It's prohibited, you see. But as I make the laws here, I can also break them. With impunity, Mr. Marks," he added, turning to Bernard, "which I'm afraid you can't do." Bernard sank into a yet more hopeless misery. "But why is it prohibited?" asked the Savage, in the excitement of meeting a man who had read Shakespeare. He had momentarily forgotten everything else. The controller shrugged his shoulders. "Because it's old, that's the chief reason. We haven't any use of old things here." "Even when they're beautiful?" "Particularly when they're beautiful. Beauty's attractive, and we don't want people to be attracted by old things. We want them to like the new ones." "But the new ones are so stupid and horrible. Those plays, where there's nothing but helicopters flying about and you feel the people kissing." He made a grimace. "Goats and monkeys." Only in Othello's words could he find an adequate vehicle for his contempt and hatred. "Nice tame animals, anyhow," the controller murmured parenthetically. "Why don't you let them see Othello instead? I've told you, it's old. Besides, they couldn't understand it." Yes, that was true. He remembered how Helmholtz had laughed at Romeo and Juliet. "Well then," he said after a pause, "something new that's like Othello, and that they could understand." That's what we've all been wanting to write," said Helmholtz, breaking a long silence. "And it's what you will never will write," said the controller, "because if it were really like Othello, nobody could understand it, however new it might be, and if it were new, it couldn't possibly be like Othello." "Why not?" "Yes, why not?" Helmholtz repeated. He too was forgetting the unpleasant realities of the situation, green with anxiety and apprehension. Only Bernard remembered them. The others ignored him. "Why not?" "Because our world is not the same as Othello's world. You can't make flivvers without steel. You can't make tragedies without social instability. The world's stable now. People are happy. They get what they want, and they never want what they can't get. They're well off. They're safe. They're never ill. They're not afraid of death. They're blissfully ignorant of passion and old age. They're plagued with no mothers or fathers. They've got no wives or children or lovers to feel strongly about. They're so conditioned that they practically can't help behaving as they ought to behave, and if anything should go wrong, there's Soma, which you go and chuck out the window in the name of liberty, Mr. Savage. Liberty," he laughed. "Expecting deltas to know what liberty is, and now expecting them to understand Othello, my good boy." The Savage was silent for a little. "All the same," he insisted obstinately, "Othello's good. Othello's better than those feelies." "Of course it is," the controller agreed. "But that's the price we have to pay for stability. We've got to choose between happiness and what people used to call high art. We've sacrificed the high art. We have the feelies and the scent organ instead." "But they don't mean anything." They mean themselves. They mean a lot of agreeable sensations to the audience. But they're told by an idiot.
Come on,
Thanks for the
stretch now.
hydrate and the stretch,
Come on,
Luca.
move it, Rock, move it!
The controller laughed. You're not being very polite to our friend, Mr. Watson, one of our most distinguished emotional engineers. But he's right, said Helmholtz gloomily, because it is idiotic. Writing when there's nothing to say. Precisely, but that requires the most enormous ingenuity. You're making flivvers out of the absolute minimum of steel, works of art out of practically nothing but pure sensation. The savage shook his head. It all seems to me quite horrible. Of course it does. Actual happiness always looks pretty squalid in comparison with the overcompensations for misery. And of course, stability isn't nearly so spectacular as instability. And being contented has none of the glamour of a good fight against misfortune, none of the picturesqueness of a struggle with temptation or a fatal overthrow by passion or doubt. Happiness is never grand. I suppose not, said the savage after a silence. But need it be quite so bad as those twins? He passed his hand over his eyes as though he were trying to wipe away the remembered image of those long rows of identical midgets at the assembling tables, those queued-up twin herds at the entrance to the Brentford monorail station, those human maggots swarming around Linda's bed of death, the endlessly repeated face of his assailants. He looked at his bandaged left hand and shuddered. Horrible. But how useful. I see you don't like our Bukhanovsky groups, but I assure you, they're the foundation on which everything is built. They're the gyroscope that stabilizes the rocket plane of state in its unswerving course. The deep voice thrillingly vibrated. The gesticulating hand implied all space and the onrush of the irresistible machine. Mustafa Man's oratory was almost up to synthetic standards. I was wondering, said the savage, why you had them at all. Seeing that you can get whatever you want out of those bottles, why don't you make everyone an Alpha Double Plus while you're about it? Mustafa Mond laughed. Because we have no wish to have our throats cut, he answered. We believe in happiness and stability. A society of alphas couldn't fail to be unstable and miserable. Imagine a factory staffed by alphas, that is to say, by separate and unrelated individuals of good heredity and conditioned so as to be capable, within limits, of making a free choice and assuming responsibilities. Imagine it, he repeated. The savage tried to imagine it, not very successfully. It's an absurdity. An alpha-decanted, alpha-conditioned man could go mad if he had to do epsilon semi-moron work. Go mad. Or start smashing things up. Alphas can be completely socialized, but only on condition that you make them do alpha work. Only an epsilon can be expected to make epsilon sacrifices, for the good reason that for him they aren't sacrifices. They're the line of least resistance. His conditioning has laid down rails along which he's got to run. He can't help himself. He's foredoomed. Even after decanting, he's still inside a bottle, an invisible bottle of infantile and embryonic fixations. Each one of us, of course, the controller meditatively continued, goes through life inside a bottle. But if we happen to be alphas, our bottles are, relatively speaking, enormous. We should suffer acutely if we were confined in a narrower space. You cannot pour upper caste champagne surrogate into lower caste bottles. It's obvious theoretically, but it has also been proved in actual practice. The result of the Cyprus experiment was convincing. What was that? Asked the savage. Mustafa Mond smiled. Well, you call it an experiment in rebooting, if you like. It began in AF 473. The Controllers had the island of Cyprus cleared of all its existing inhabitants and recolonized with a specially prepared batch of 22,000 alphas. All agricultural and industrial equipment was handed over to them, and they were left to manage their own affairs. The result exactly fulfilled all the theoretical predictions. The land wasn't properly worked. There were strikes in all the factories. The laws were set at naught. Orders disobeyed. All the people detailed for a spell of a low-grade work were perpetually intriguing for high-grade jobs, and all the people with high-grade jobs were counter-intriguing at all costs to stay where they were. Within 6 years, they were having a first-class civil war. When 19 out of 22,000 had been killed, the survivors unanimously petitioned the world controllers to resume the government of the island, which they did, and that was the end of the only society of alphas that the world has ever seen. Savage sighed profoundly. The optimum population, said Mustafa Mond, is modeled on the iceberg. 8/9 below the waterline, 1/9 above. And they're happy below the waterline? Happier than above it. Happier than your friend here, for example, he pointed. In spite of that awful work. Awful? They don't find it so. On the contrary, they like it. It's light. It's childishly simple. No strain on the mind or the muscles. 7.5 hours of mild, unexhausting labor, and then the soma ration and games and unrestricted copulation and the feelies. What more can they ask for? True, he added. They might ask for shorter hours, and of course we could give them shorter hours. Technically, it would be perfectly simple to reduce all lower caste working hours to 3 or 4 a day. But would they be any happier for that? No, they wouldn't. The experiment was tried more than a century and a half ago. The whole of Ireland was put on the 4-hour day. What was the result? Unrest and a large increase in the consumption of soma. That was all. Those 3.5 hours of extra leisure were so far from being a source of happiness that people felt constrained to take a holiday from them. The Inventions Office is stuffed with plans for labor-saving processes. Thousands of them. Mustafa Mond made a lavish gesture. And why don't we put them into execution? For the sake of the laborers. It would be sheer cruelty to afflict them with excessive leisure. It's the same with agriculture. We could synthesize every morsel of food if we wanted to, but we don't. We prefer to keep 1/3 of the population on the land for their own sakes, because it takes longer to get food out of the land than out of a factory. Besides, we have our stability to think of. We don't want to change. Every change is a menace to stability. That's another reason why we're so chary of applying new inventions. Every discovery in pure science is potentially subversive. Even science must sometimes be treated as a possible enemy. Yes, even science. Science? Savage frowned. He knew the word, but what exactly it signified he could not say. Shakespeare and the old men of the Pueblo had never mentioned science, and from Linda he'd only gathered the vaguest hints. Science was something you made helicopters with, something that caused you to laugh at the corn dances, something that prevented you from being wrinkled and losing your teeth. He made a desperate effort to take the controller's meaning. Excuse me for a second. Yes, Mustafa Mond was saying. Sorry. Yes, Mustafa Mond was saying. That's another item in the cost of stability. It's the only art that's incompatible with happiness. It's also science. Science is dangerous. We have to keep it most carefully chained and muzzled. What? Said Helmholtz in astonishment. But we're always saying that science is everything. It's a hypnopedic platitude. 3 times a week between 13 and 17, put in Bernard. And all the science propaganda we do at the college. Yes, but what sort of science? Asked Mustafa Mond sarcastically. You've had no scientific training, so you can't judge. I was a pretty good physicist in my time. Too good. Good enough to realize that all our science is just a cookery book, with an orthodox theory of cooking that nobody's allowed to question, and a list of recipes that mustn't be added to, except by special permission from the head cook. I'm the head cook now, but I was an inquisitive young scullion once. I started doing a bit of cooking on my own, unorthodox cooking, illicit cooking, a bit of real science, in fact. He was silent. What happened? Asked Helmholtz Watson. The controller sighed. Very nearly what's going to happen to you, young man. I was on the point of being sent to an island. The words galvanized Bernard into violent and unseemly activity. Send me to an island? He jumped up, ran across the room, and stood gesticulating in front of the controller. You can't send me. I haven't done anything. It was the others. I swear it was the others. He pointed accusingly to Helmholtz and the savage. Oh, please don't send me to Iceland. I promise I'll do what I ought to do. Give me another chance. Please give me another chance. The tears began to flow. I tell you it's their fault, he sobbed. And not to Iceland. Oh, please, your fortune, please. And in a paroxysm of abjection, he threw himself on his knees before the controller. Mustafa Mann tried to make him get up, but Bernard persisted in his groveling. The stream of words poured out inexhaustibly. In the end, the controller had to ring for his fourth secretary. Bring 3 men, he ordered, and take Mr. Marks into a bedroom. Give him a good soma vaporization and put him to bed and leave him. The fourth secretary went out and returned with 3 green-uniformed twin footmen. Still shouting and sobbing, Bernard was carried out. One would think he was going to have his throat cut, said the controller as the door closed, whereas, if he had the smallest sense, he'd understand that his punishment is really a reward. He's being sent to an island, that's to say, he's being sent to a place where he'll meet the most interesting set of men and women to be found anywhere in the world. All the people who, for one reason or another, have got too self-conscious, who have got too self-consciously individual to fit into community life. All the people who aren't satisfied with orthodoxy, who've got too independent ideas of their own, who've got independent ideas of their own. Everyone, in a word, who's anyone. I almost envy you, Mr. Watson. Helmholtz laughed. Then why aren't you on an island yourself? Because, finally, I preferred this, the controller answered. I was given the choice to be sent to an island where I could have got on with my pure science, or to be taken onto the controller's council with the prospect of succeeding in due course to an actual controllership. I chose this and let the science go. After a little silence, sometimes, he added, I rather regret the science. Happiness is a hard matter. Happiness is a hard master, particularly other people's happiness. A much harder master, if one isn't conditioned to accept it unquestioningly, than truth. He sighed, fell silent again, then continued in a brisker tone. Well, duty's duty. One can't consult one's own preference. I'm interested in truth. I like science. But truth's a menace. Science is a public danger. As dangerous as it's been beneficent. It has given us the stablest equilibrium in history. China's was hopelessly insecure by comparison. Even the primitive matriarchies weren't steadier than we are. Thanks, I repeat, to science. But we can't allow science to undo its own good work. That's why we so carefully limit the scope of its researches. That's why I almost got sent to an island. We don't allow it to deal with any but the most immediate problems of the moment. All other inquiries are most sedulously discouraged. It's curious, he went on after a little pause, to read what people in the time of our Ford used to write about scientific progress. They seem to have imagined that it could be allowed to go on indefinitely, regardless of everything else. Knowledge was the highest good, truth the supreme value. All the rest was secondary and subordinate. True, ideas were beginning to change even then. Our Ford himself did a great deal to shift the emphasis from truth and beauty to comfort and happiness. Mass production demanded the shift. Universal happiness keeps the wheels steadily turning. Truth and beauty can't. And of course, whenever the masses seized political power, then it was happiness rather than truth and beauty that mattered. Still, in spite of everything, unrestricted scientific research was still permitted. People still went on talking about truth and beauty, as though they were the sovereign goods, right up to the time of the 9 Years' War. That made them change their tune, all right. That's the point of truth or beauty or knowledge when the anthrax bombs are popping all around you. That was when science first began to be controlled, after the 9 Years' War. People were ready to have their appetites controlled then. Anything for a quiet life. We've gone on controlling ever since. It hasn't been very good for truth, of course, but it's been very good for happiness. One can't have something for nothing. Happiness has got to be paid for. You're paying for it, Mr. Watson. Paying because you happen to be too much interested in beauty. I was too much interested in truth. I paid too. But you didn't go to an island, said the savage, breaking a long silence. The controller smiled. That's how I paid, by choosing to serve happiness. Other people's, not mine. It's lucky, he added, after a pause, that there are such a lot of islands in the world. I don't know what we should do without them. Put you all in the lethal chamber, I suppose? By the way, Mr. Watson, would you like a tropical climate? The Marquesas, for example, or Samoa, or something rather more bracing. Helmholtz rose from his pneumatic chair. I should like a thoroughly bad climate, he answered. I believe one would write better if the climate were bad. If there were a lot of wind and storms, for example. The controller nodded his approbation. I like your spirit, Mr. Watson. I like it very much indeed. As much as I officially disapprove of it, he smiled. What about the Falkland Islands? Yes, I think that will do, Helmholtz answered. And now, if you don't mind, I'll go and see how poor Bernard's getting on. Chapter 17. Art. Science. You seem to have paid a fairly high price for your happiness, said the savage. When they were alone. Anything else? Well, religion, of course, replied the controller. There used to be something called God before the 9 Years' War. But I was forgetting. You know all about God, I suppose. Well, the savage hesitated. He would have liked to say something about solitude, about night, about the mesa lying pale under the moon, about the precipice, the plunge into shadowy darkness, about death. He would have liked to speak, but there were no words, not even in Shakespeare. The controller, meanwhile, had crossed to the other side of the room and was unlocking a large safe set into the wall between the bookshelves. The heavy door swung open. Rummaging in the darkness within, It's a subject, he said, that has always had a great interest for me. He pulled out a thick black volume. You've never read this, for example? The savage took it. The Holy Bible, containing the Old and New Testaments, he read. He read aloud from the title page. Nor this. It was a small book, and lost its cover. The Imitation of Christ. Nor this. He handed out another volume. The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. And I've got plenty more, Mustafa Mond continued, resuming his seat. A whole collection of pornographic old books. God in the safe and Ford on the shelves. He pointed with a laugh to his avowed library, to the shelves of books, the rack full of reading machine bobbins and soundtrack rolls. But if you know about God, why don't you tell them? Asked the savage indignantly. Why don't you give them these books about God? For the same reason we don't give them Othello. They're old. They're about God hundreds of years ago, not about God now. But God doesn't change. Men do, though. What difference does that make? All the difference in the world, said Mustapha Mond. He got up again and walked to the safe. There was a man called Cardinal Newman, he said. A cardinal, he exclaimed parenthetically, was a kind of arch-community songster. I, Pandulph of fair Milan, Cardinal. I've read about them in Shakespeare. Of course you have. Well, as I was saying, there was a man named Cardinal Newman. Ah, here's the book. He pulled it out. And while I'm about it, I'll take this one too. It's a man called Maine de Biran. He was a philosopher, if you know what that was. A man who dreams of fewer things than there are in heaven and earth, said the savage promptly. Quite so. I'll read you one of the things he did. Quite so. I'll read you one of the things he did dream of in a moment. Meanwhile, shit. Give me just a second. Meanwhile, listen to what this old arch-community songster said. He opened the book at the place marked by a slip of paper and began to read. We are not our own anymore. We are not our own any more than what we possess is our own. We did not make ourselves. We cannot be supreme over ourselves. We are not our own masters. We are God's property. Is it not our happiness thus to view the matter? Is it any happiness or any comfort to consider that we are our own? It may be thought so by the young and prosperous. These may think it a great thing to have everything, as they suppose, their own way, to depend on no one, to have to think of nothing out of sight, to be without the irksomeness of continual acknowledgment, continual prayer, continual reference of what they do to the will of another. But as time goes on, they, as all men, will find that independence was not made for man, that it is an unnatural state, will do for a while, but will not carry us on safely to the end. Mustapha Mond paused, put down the first book, and picking up the other, turned over the pages. Take this, for example, he said, in a deep voice once more began to read. A man grows old. He feels in himself that radical sense of weakness, of listlessness, of discomfort, which accompanies the advance of age, and feeling thus, imagines himself merely sick, lulling his fears with the notion that this distressing condition is due to some particular cause, from which, as from an illness, he hopes to recover. Vain imaginings. That sickness is old age, and a horrible disease it is. They say it is the fear of death and of what comes after death that makes men turn to religion as they advance in years. But my own experience has given me the conviction that quite apart from any such terrors or imaginings, the religious sentiment tends to develop as we grow older, to develop because, as the passions grow calm, as the fancy and sensibilities are less excited and less excitable, our reason becomes less troubled in its working, less obscured by the images, desires, and distractions in which it used to be absorbed, whereupon God emerges as from behind a cloud. Our soul feels, sees, turns towards the source of all light, turns naturally and inevitably. For now that all that gave to the world of sensations its life and charms has begun to leak away from us, now that phenomenal existence is no more bolstered by impressions from within or from without, we feel the need to lean on something that abides, something that will never play us false, a reality, an absolute and everlasting truth. Yes, we inevitably turn to God, for this religious sentiment is of its nature so pure, so delightful to the soul, that experiences it, that it makes up to us for all our other losses. Mustafa Mond shut the book and leaned back in his chair. One of the numerous things in heaven and earth that these philosophers didn't dream about was this. He waved his hand. Us, the modern world. You can only be independent of God while you've got youth and prosperity. Independence won't take you safely to the end. Well, we've now got youth and prosperity right up to the end. What follows? Evidently, that we can be independent of God. The religious sentiment will compensate us for all our losses. But there aren't any losses for us to compensate. Religious sentiment is superfluous. And why should we go hunting for a substitute for youthful desires when youthful desires never fail? A substitute for distractions when we go on enjoying all the old fooleries to the very last. What need have we of repose when our minds and bodies continue to delight in activity, of consolation when we have soma, of something immovable when there is the social order? Then you think there is no God? No, I think there quite probably is one. Then why? Mustafa Mond checked him. But he manifests himself in different ways to different men. In pre-modern times, he manifested himself as that being that's described in these books. Now... How does he manifest himself now? Asked the savage. Well, he manifests himself as an absence, as though he weren't there at all. That's your fault. Call it the fault of civilization. God isn't compatible with machinery and scientific medicine and universal happiness. You must make your choice. Our civilization has chosen machinery and medicine and happiness. That's why I have to keep these books locked up in a safe. They're smut. People would be shocked if... The savage interrupted him. But isn't it natural to feel that there's a God? You might as well ask if it's natural to do up one's trousers with zippers, said the controller sarcastically. You remind me of another of those old fellows called Bradley. He defined philosophy as the finding of bad reason for what one believes by instinct, as if one believed anything by instinct. One believes things because one has been conditioned to believe them. Finding bad reasons for what one believes for other bad reasons. That's philosophy. People believe in God because they've been conditioned to believe in God. But all the same, insisted the savage, it is natural to believe in God when you're alone, quite alone, in the night, thinking about death. But people never are alone now, said Mustafa Mond. We make them hate solitude, and we arrange their lives so that it's almost impossible for them to ever have it. The savage nodded gloomily. At Malpais he had suffered because they had shut him out from the communal activities of the Pueblo. In civilized London he was suffering because he could never escape from those communal activities, never be quietly alone. Do you remember that bit in King Lear? Said the savage at last. The gods are just, and of our peasants' vices make instruments to plague us. The dark and vicious place where he got cost him in his eyes. And Edmund answers, You remember, he's wounded, he's dying. Thou hast spoken right. 'Tis true. The wheel has come full circle. I am here. What about that now? Doesn't there seem to be a God managing things, punishing, rewarding? Well, does there? Questioned the controller in his turn. You can indulge in any number of pleasant vices with a free martin and run no risk of having your eyes put out by your son's mistress. The wheel has come full circle. I am here. But where would Edmund be nowadays? Sitting in a pneumatic chair with his arm round a girl's waist, sucking away at his sex hormone chewing gum and looking at the feelies. The gods are just, no doubt, but their code of law is dictated, in the last resort, by the people who organize society. Providence takes its cue from men. Are you sure? Asked the savage. Are you quite sure that the Edmund in that pneumatic chair hasn't been just as heavily punished as the Edmund who's wounded and bleeding to death? The gods are just. Haven't they used his pleasant vices as an instrument to degrade him? Degrade him from what position? As a happy, hard-working, goods-consuming citizen, he's perfect. Of course, if you choose some other standard than ours, then perhaps you might say he was degraded. But you've got to stick to one set of postulates. You can't play electromagnetic golf according to the rules of centrifugal bumblepuppy. But value dwells not in particular will, said the savage. It holds his estimate and dignity as well, wherein 'tis precious of itself, as in the prizer. Come, protested Mustafa Mond. That's going rather far, isn't it? If you allowed yourselves to think of God, you wouldn't allow yourselves to be degraded by pleasant vices. You'd have a reason for bearing things patiently, for doing things with courage. I've seen it with the Indians. I'm sure you have, said Mustafa Mond. But then we aren't Indians. There isn't any need for a civilized man to bear anything that's seriously unpleasant. And as for doing things, Lord forbid that he should get the idea into his head. It would upset the whole social order if men started doing things on their own. What about self-denial, then? If you had a god, you'd have a reason for self-denial. But industrial civilization is only possible when there's no self-denial. Self-indulgence up to the very limits imposed by hygiene and economics. Otherwise, the wheels stop turning. You'd have a reason for chastity, said the savage, blushing a little as he spoke the words. But chastity means passion. Chastity means neurasthenia. And passion and neurasthenia mean instability. And instability means the end of civilization. You can't have a lasting civilization without plenty of pleasant vices. But God's the reason for everything noble and fine and heroic. If you had a God... My dear young friend, said Mustafa Mond, civilization has absolutely no need of nobility or heroism. These things are symptoms of political inefficiency. In a properly organized society like ours, nobody has any opportunities for being noble or heroic. Conditions have got to be thoroughly unstable before the occasion can arise. Where there are wars, where there are divided allegiances, where there are temptations to be resisted, objects of love to be fought for or defended, there obviously nobility and heroism have some sense. But there aren't any wars nowadays. The greatest care is taken to prevent you from loving anyone too much. There's no such thing as a divided allegiance. You're so conditioned that you can't help doing what you ought to do. And what you ought to do is on the whole so pleasant. So many of the natural impulses are allowed free play that there really aren't any temptations to resist. And if ever, by some unlucky chance, anything unpleasant should somehow happen, why, there's always Soma to give you a holiday from the facts. And there's always Soma to calm your anger, to reconcile you to your enemies, to make you patient and long-suffering. In the past, you could only accomplish these things by making a great effort, and after years of hard moral training. Now you swallow 2 or 3 half-gram tablets, and there you are. Anybody can be virtuous now. You can carry at least half your mortality about in a bottle. Christianity without tears. That's what Soma is. But the tears are necessary. Don't you remember what Othello said? If after every tempest came such calms, may the winds blow till they had wakened death. There's a story one of the old Indians used to tell us about the girl of Mataski. The young men who wanted to marry her had to do a morning's hoeing in her garden. It seemed easy, but there were flies and mosquitoes, magic ones. Most of the young men simply couldn't stand the biting and stinging, but the one that could, he got the girl. Charming, but in civilized countries, said the controller, You can have girls without hoeing for them, and there aren't any flies or mosquitoes to sting you. We got rid of them all centuries ago." The savage nodded, frowning. "You got rid of them, yes. That's just like you. Getting rid of everything unpleasant instead of learning to put up with it. Whether 'tis better in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. But you don't do either. Neither suffer nor oppose. You just abolish the slings and arrows. It's too easy." He was suddenly silent, thinking of his mother in her room on the 37th floor. Linda had floated in a sea of singing lights and perfumed caresses, floated away out of space, out of time, out of the prison of her memories, her habits, her aged and bloated body, and Tomakin, ex-director of hatcheries and conditioning. Tomakin was still on holiday from humiliation and pain, in a world where he could not hear those words, that derisive laughter, could not see that hideous face, feel those moist and flabby arms round his neck, in a beautiful world. "What you need," the savage went on, "is something with tears for a change. Nothing costs enough here." $12.5 million, Henry Foster had protested when the savage told him that. $12.5 million. That's what the new conditioning center cost. Not a cent less. Exposing what is mortal and unsure to all the fortune, death, and danger dare, even for an eggshell. Isn't there something in that? He asked, looking up at Mustafa Mond. Quite apart from God, though of course God would be a reason for it. Isn't there something in living dangerously? "There's a great deal in it," the controller replied. "Men and women must have their adrenals stimulated from time to time." "What?" questioned the savage, uncomprehending. "It's one of the conditions of perfect health. That's why we've made the VPS treatments compulsory." VPS? Violent Passion Surrogate. Regularly, once a month, we flood the whole system with adrenaline. It's the complete physiological equivalent of fear and rage. All the tonic effects of murdering Desdemona and being murdered by Othello, without any of the inconveniences. "But I like the inconveniences." "We don't," said the controller. "We prefer to do things comfortably." "But I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin." "In fact," said Mustafa Mond, "you're claiming the right to be unhappy." "All right then," said the savage defiantly. "I'm claiming the right to be unhappy. Not to mention the right to grow old and ugly and impotent, the right to have syphilis and cancer, the right to have too little to eat, the right to be lousy, the right to live in constant apprehension of what may happen tomorrow, the right to catch typhoid, the right to be tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind." There was a long silence. "I claim them all," said the savage at last. Mustafa Mond shrugged his shoulders. "You're welcome," he said. I do believe this is the last chapter, chapter 18. The door was ajar. They entered. "John!" From the bathroom came an unpleasant and characteristic sound. "Is there anything the matter?" Helmholtz called. There was no answer. The unpleasant sound was repeated. Twice. There was silence. Then with a click the bathroom door opened, and very pale the savage emerged. "I say," Helmholtz exclaimed solicitously, "you do look ill, John." "Did you eat something that didn't agree with you?" asked Bernard. The savage nodded. "I ate civilization." "What?" "It poisoned me. I was defiled, and then," he added in a lower tone, "I ate my own wickedness." "Yes, but what exactly? I mean, just now you were—" "Now I am purified," said the savage. "I drank some mustard and warm water." The others stared at him in astonishment. "Do you mean to say that you were doing it on purpose?" said Bernard. That's how the Indians always purify themselves. He sat down, and sighing, passed his hand across his forehead. I shall rest for a few minutes, he said. I'm rather tired. Well, I'm not surprised, said Helmholtz. After a silence, we've come to say goodbye, he went on in another tone. We're off tomorrow morning. Yes, we're off tomorrow morning, said Bernard, on whose face the savage remarked a new expression of determined resignation. And by the way, John, he continued, leaning forward in his chair and laying a hand on the savage's knee, I want to say how sorry I am about everything that happened yesterday. He blushed. How ashamed, he went on, in spite of the unsteadiness of his voice. How really... The savage cut him short, taking his hand, affectionately pressed it. Helmholtz was wonderful to me, Bernard resumed, after a little pause. If it hadn't been for him, I should... Now, Helmholtz protested. There was a silence, in spite of their sadness, because of it. Even for their sadness was the symptom of their love for one another. The three young men were happy. I went to see the controller this morning, said the savage at last. What for? To ask him if I mightn't go to the islands with you. And what did he say? Asked Helmholtz eagerly. The savage shook his head. He wouldn't let me. Why not? He said he wanted to go on with the experiment. But I'm damned, the savage added, with sudden fury. I'm damned if he'll go on being experimented with. Not for all the controllers in the world. I shall go away tomorrow, too. But where? The others asked in unison. The savage shrugged his shoulders. Anywhere. I don't care. Oh, shit. Pre-rolls are on. Anywhere. I don't care, as long as I can be alone. From Guildford, the down line followed the Way Valley to Godalming, then over Milford and Whitley, proceeded to Haslemere, and through Petersfield through Portsmouth. Roughly parallel to it, the upline passed over Vorpelston, Tongham, Puttenham, Elstead, and Graysott. Between the Hogsback and Hindhead, there were points where the two lines were not more than 6 or 7 kilometers apart. The distance was too small for careless flyers, particularly at night when they had taken half a gram too much. There had been accidents, serious ones. It had been decided to deflect the upline a few kilometers to the west, between Graysott and Tongham. 4 abandoned air lighthouses marked the course of the old Portsmouth to London road. The skies above them were silent and deserted. It was over Selborne, Borden, and Farnham that the helicopters now ceaselessly hummed and roared. The savage had chosen as his hermitage the old lighthouse which stood on the crest of the hill between Puttenham and Elstead. The building was of ferro-concrete and in excellent condition. Almost too comfortable, the savage had thought when he first explored the place, almost too civilizedly luxurious. He pacified his conscience by promising himself a compensatingly harder self-discipline, purifications the more complete and thorough. His first night in the hermitage was, deliberately, a sleepless one. He spent the hours on his knees praying, now to that heaven from which the guilty Claudius had begged forgiveness, now in Zuni to Awanawilona, and now to Jesus and Pukong, now to his own guardian animal, the eagle. From time to time he stretched out his arms as though he were on the cross, and held them thus through long minutes of an ache that gradually increased, till it became a tremulous and excruciating agony, held them in voluntary crucifixion, while he repeated, through clenched teeth, the sweat meanwhile pouring down his face, "Oh, forgive me, oh, make me pure, Oh, help me to be good, again and again, till he was on the point of fainting from the pain. When morning came, he felt he had earned the right to inhabit the lighthouse. Yet, even though there still was glass in most of the windows, even though the view from the platform was so fine, for the very reason why he had chosen the lighthouse. Shit, where'd I lose it? Where'd it go? Inhabit the lighthouse, yet even though there was still glass in most of the windows, even though the view from the platform was so fine, for the very reason why he had chosen the lighthouse had become almost instantly a reason for going somewhere else. He had decided to live there because the view was so beautiful, because from this vantage point, he seemed to be looking out on the incarnation of a divine being. But who was he to be pampered with the daily and hourly sight of loveliness? Who was he to be living in the visible presence of God? All he deserved to live in was some filthy sty, some blind hole in the ground, stiff and still aching after his long night of pain, but for that very reason inwardly reassured. He climbed up to the platform of his tower, looked out over the bright sunrise world which he had regained the right to inhabit. On the north, the view was bounded by the long chalk ridge of the Hog's Back, from behind whose eastern extremity rose the towers of the 7 skyscrapers which constituted Guildford. Seeing them, the savage made a grimace, but he was to become reconciled to them in course of time, for at night they twinkled gaily with the geometrical constellations, or else floodlighted, pointed their luminous fingers, with a gesture whose significance nobody in England but the savage now understood, solemnly towards the plumbless mysteries of heaven. In the valley which separated the Hog's Back from the sandy hill on which the lighthouse stood, Putnam was a modest little village, 9 stories high, with silos, a poultry farm, and a small vitamin D factory. On the other side of the lighthouse, towards the south, the ground fell away in long slopes of heather to a chain of ponds. Yawn? You're yawning. Did I yawn? I don't know. Beyond them, above the intervening woods, rose the 14-story Tower of Elstead. Dim in the hazy English air, Hindhead and Selborne invited the eye into a blue romantic distance. But it was not alone the distance that had attracted the savage to this lighthouse. The near was as seductive as the far. The woods, the open stretches of heather and yellow gorse, the clumps of Scottish firs, the shining ponds with their overhanging birch trees, their water lilies, their beds of rushes. Oh, it looked like you yawned. You put your hand over your mouth and inhaled. Oh, yeah. I'm always fucking with my collar while I'm reading. That's why it always looks like I'm putting my hand up to my face all the time. These were beautiful, and to an eye accustomed to the aridities of the American desert, astonishing. And then the solitude. Whole days passed during which he never saw a human being. The lighthouse was only a quarter of an hour's flight from the Charing T Tower, but the hills of Malpais were hardly more deserted than this Surrey heath. The crowds that daily left London left it only to play electromagnetic golf or tennis. Putnam possessed no links. The nearest Riemann surfaces were Guildford. Flowers and a landscape were the only attractions here, and so, as there was no good reason for coming, nobody came. During the first days, the savage lived alone and undisturbed. Of the money which, on his first arrival, John had received for his personal expenses, most had been spent on his equipment. Before leaving London, he had bought 4 viscose woolen blankets, rope and strings, nails, glue, a few tools, matches, though he intended in due course to make a fire drill, some pots and pans, 24 packets of seeds, and 10 kilograms of wheat flour. No, not synthetic starch and cotton waste flour substitute, he had insisted, even though it is more nourishing, But when it came to pan-glandular biscuits and vitaminized beef surrogate, he had not been able to resist the shopman's persuasion. Looking at the tins now, he bitterly reproached himself for his weakness. Loathsome civilized stuff. He had made up his mind that he would never eat it, even if he were starving. That'll teach them, he thought vindictively. It would also teach him. Alright, I'm using my last snooze, and I think I should be able to finish the book here. He counted his money. The little that remained would be enough, he hoped, to tide him over the winter. By next spring, his garden would be producing enough to make him independent of the outside world. Meanwhile, there would always be game. He had seen plenty of rabbits, and there were waterfowl on the ponds. He set to work at once to make a bow and arrows. There were ash trees near the lighthouse, and 4 arrow shafts, a whole corpse full of beautifully straight hazel saplings. A whole copse full of beautifully straight hazel saplings. He began by felling a young ash, cut out 6 feet of unbranched stem, stripped off the bark, and paring by paring, shaved away the white wood, as old Mitsima had taught him, until he had a stave of his own height, stiff at the thickened center, lively and quick at the slender tips. The work gave him an intense pleasure, and after those weeks of idleness in London, with nothing to do, whenever he wanted anything but to press a switch or turn a handle, it was pure delight to be doing something that demanded skill and patience. He almost finished whittling the stave into shape when he realized with a start that he was singing. Singing! It was as though, stumbling upon himself from the outside, he had suddenly caught himself out, taken himself flagrantly at fault. Guiltily he blushed. After all, it was not to sing and enjoy himself that he had come here. It was to escape further contamination by the filth of civilized life. It was to be purified and made good. It was actively to make amends. He realized to his dismay that, absorbed in the whittling of his bow, he had forgotten what he had sworn to. Himself he would constantly remember, poor Linda, his own murderous unkindness to her, and those loathsome twins swarming like lice around the mystery of her death, insulting with their presence not merely his own grief and repentance, but the very gods themselves. He had sworn to remember, he had sworn unceasingly to make amends, and there was he, sitting happily over his bow stave, singing, actually singing. He went indoors, opened the box of mustard, and put some water to boil on the fire. Half an hour later, 3 Delta Minus land workers from one of the Putnam-Bokanovsky groups happened to be driving to Elstead, and at the top of the hill were astonished to see a young man standing outside the abandoned lighthouse, stripped to the waist and hitting himself with a whip of knotted cords. His back was horizontally streaked with crimson, and from wheel to wheel ran thin trickles of blood. The driver of the lorry pulled up at the side of the road, and with his 2 companions stared open-mouthed at the extraordinary spectacle. 1, 2, 3, they counted the strokes. After the 8th, the young man interrupted his self-punishment to run to the wood's edge, and there be violently sick. When he had finished, he picked up the whip and began hitting himself again. 9, 10, 11, 12. "Ford," whispered the driver, and his twins were of the same opinion. 40, they said. 3 days later, like turkey buzzards settling on a corpse, the reporters came. Dried and hardened over a slow fire of green wood, the bow was ready. The savage was busy on his arrows. 30 hazel sticks had been whittled and dried, tipped with sharp nails, carefully nocked. He had made a raid one night on the Putnam poultry farm, and now had feathers enough to equip a whole armory. It was at work upon the feathering of his shafts that the first of the reporters found him. Noiseless on his pneumatic shoes, the man came up behind him. "Good morning, Mr. Savage," he said. "I'm the representative of the hourly radio." Startled as though by the bite of a snake, the savage sprang to his feet, scattering arrows, feathers, glue pot, and brush in all directions. "I beg your pardon," said the reporter, with genuine compunction. "I had no intention." He touched his hat, the aluminum stovepipe hat in which he carried his wireless receiver and transmitter.
"Excuse my not taking it off," he said. "It's a bit heavy. Well, as I was saying, I'm the representative of the hourly—" "What do you want?" asked the Savage, scowling. The reporter returned his most ingratiating smile. "Well, of course, our readers would be profoundly interested." He put his head on one side. His smile became almost coquettish. "Just a few words from you, Mr. Savage." And rapidly, with a series of ritual gestures, he uncoiled 2 wires connected to the portable battery buckled round his waist, plugged them simultaneously into the sides of his aluminum hat, touched a spring on the crown, and antennae shot up into the air, touched another spring on the peak of the brim, and like a jack-in-the-box, out jumped a microphone and hung there, quivering, 6 inches from his nose, pulled down a pair of receivers over his ears, pressed a switch on the left side of the hat, and from within came a faint, waspy buzzing, turned a knob on the right, and the buzzing was interrupted by a stethoscopic wheeze and cackle, by hiccups and sudden squeaks. "Hello?" he said to the microphone. "Hello, hello?" A bell suddenly rang inside his hat. "Is that you, Edsel?" "Primo Melon speaking. Yes, I've got hold of him. Mr. Savage will now take the microphone and say a few words, won't you, Mr. Savage?" He looked up at the Savage with another of those winning smiles of his. Just tell our readers why you came here. What made you leave London? Hold on, Edsel. So very suddenly, and of course, that whip." The Savage started. How did they know about the whip? "We're all crazy to know about the whip. And then something about civilization. You know, the sort of stuff, what I think of a civilized girl. Just a few words, a very few." The Savage obeyed with a disconcerting literalness. 5 words he uttered, and no more. 5 words. Same as those he had said to Bernard about the arch community songster of Canterbury. "Ani sons eso tsena." And seizing the reporter by the shoulder, he spun him round. The young man revealed himself invitingly, well covered, aimed, and, with all the force and accuracy of a champion foot and mouth baller, delivered a most prodigious kick. 8 minutes later, a new edition of the Hourly Radio was on sale in the streets of London. Hourly Radio was coccyx kicked by Mystery Savage, ran the headlines on the front page. Sensation in Surrey. Sensation even in London, thought the reporter when, on his return, he read the words, and a very painful sensation. What was more, he sat down gingerly to his luncheon. Okay, I'm not going to finish the chapter before the ad goes, and I don't have any more snoozes. So I'm going to run a 3-minute ad. I'm going to go ahead and be right back with some water, and then we'll finish the book and continue on for a little while. Thanks for sticking around.
back. All right. Sensation even in London, though the reporter even fuck me, I can't read. Sensation even in London, thought the reporter when, on his return, he read the words, and a very painful sensation, what was more. He sat down gingerly to his luncheon. Undeterred by that cautionary bruise on their colleague's coccyx, 4 other reporters representing the New York Times, the Frankfurt Four-Dimensional Continuum, the Fortean Science Monitor, and the Delta Mirror called that afternoon at the lighthouse and met with receptions of progressively increasing violence. From a safe distance and still rubbing his buttocks, "Benighted fool," shouted the man from the Fortean Science Monitor. "Why don't you take Soma?" "Get away!" The savage shook his fist. The other retreated a few steps, then turned around again. "Evil's an unreality if you take a couple of grams." "Kohakwa! Iathokyai." The tone was menacingly derisive. "Pain's a delusion." "Oh, is it?" said the savage, and picking up a thick hazel switch, strode forward. "Yes, happy birthday again to Twitchy. Welcome in, silly. You finally wake up." The man from the Fortean Science Monitor made a dash for his helicopter. After that, the savage was left for a time in peace. A few helicopters came and hovered inquisitively round the tower. He shot an arrow into the He shot an arrow into the importunately nearest of them. It pierced the aluminum floor of the cabin. There was a shrill yell, and the machine went rocketing up into the air with all the acceleration that its supercharger could give it. The others, in future, kept their distance respectfully. Ignoring their tiresome humming, he likened himself in his imagination to one of the suitors of the Maiden of Matsaki, unmoved and persistent among the winged vermin. The savage dug at what was to be his garden. After a time, the vermin evidently became bored and flew away. For hours at a stretch, the sky above his head was empty, and but for the larks, silent. The weather was breathlessly hot. There was thunder in the air. He had dug all the morning and was resting, stretched out along the floor. And suddenly the thought of Lenina was a real presence, naked and tangible, saying, "Sweet," and "Put your arms around me," in shoes and socks, perfumed, impudent strumpet. But oh, her arms round his neck, the lifting of her breasts, her mouth. Eternity was in our lips and eyes. Lenina. No. He sprang to his feet, and half naked as he was, ran out of the house. At the edge of the heath stood a clump of hoary juniper bushes. He flung himself against them. He embraced not the smooth body of his desires, but an armful of green spikes. Sharp with 1,000 points, they pricked him. He tried to think of poor Linda, breathless and dumb, with her clutching hands and the unutterable terror in her eyes. Poor Linda, whom he had sworn to remember, but it was still the presence of Lenina that haunted him. Lenina, whom he had promised to forget. Even through the stab and sting of the juniper needles, his wincing flesh was aware of her, unescapably real. Sweet, and if you wanted me to, why didn't you? The whip was hanging on a nail by the door, ready to hand against the arrival of reporters. In a frenzy, the savage ran back to the house, seized it, whirled it. The knotted cords bit into his flesh. Strumpet! He shouted at every blow as though it were Lenina, and how frantically, without knowing it, he wished it were. White, warm, scented, infamous Lenina that he was flogging thus. Strumpet! And then, in a voice of despair, "Oh, Linda, forgive me, God. I'm bad, I'm wicked, No, you strumpet. From his carefully constructed hide in the wood, 300 meters away, Darwin Bonaparte, the Feelies Corporation's most expert big game photographer, had watched the whole proceedings. Patience and skill had been rewarded.
He had spent 3 days sitting inside the bole of an artificial oak tree, 3 nights crawling on his belly through the heather, hiding microphones in gorse bushes, burying wires in the soft gray sand. 72 hours of profound discomfort. But now the great moment had come, the greatest. Darwin Bonaparte had time to reflect as he moved among his instruments. The greatest since his taking of the famous all-howling stereoscopic feelie of the gorilla's wedding. Splendid, he said to himself as the savage started his astonishing performance. Splendid. He kept his telescopic cameras carefully aimed, glued to their moving objective, clapped on a higher power to get a close-up of the frantic and distorted face. Admirable. Switched over, for half a minute, to slow motion, an exquisitely comical effect, he promised himself. Listened in, meanwhile, to the blows, the groans, the wild and raving words that were recorded on the soundtrack at the edge of the film. Tried the effect of a little amplification. Yes, that was decidedly better. Was delighted to hear, in a momentary lull, the shrill singing of a lark. Wished the savage would turn round so that he could get a good close-up of the blood on his back. And almost instantly, what astonishing luck, the accommodating fellow did turn round, and he was able to take a perfect close-up. Well, that was grand, he said to himself, when it was all over. Really grand. He mopped his face. When they had put in the feelie effects at the studio, it would be a wonderful film, almost as good, thought de Bonaparte, as the sperm whale's love life, and that, by Ford, was saying a good deal. 12 days later, the Savage of Surrey had been released and could be seen, heard, and felt in every first-class feelie palace in Western Europe. The effect of Darwin Bonaparte's film was immediate and enormous. On the afternoon which followed the evening of its release, John's rustic solitude was suddenly broken by the arrival overhead of a great swarm of helicopters. He was digging in his garden, digging, too, in his own mind, laboriously turning up the substance of his thought. Death. And he drove his spade once again. And he drove in his spade once, and again, and yet again. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. A convincing thunder rumbled through the words. He lifted another spadeful of earth. Why had Linda died? Why had she been allowed to become gradually less than human, and at last, he shuddered. A good kissing carrion. He planted his foot on the spade and stamped it fiercely into the tough ground. As flies to wanton boys are, we go to the gods. They kill us for their sport. Thunder again. Words that proclaimed themselves true, truer somehow than truth itself. And yet that same Gloucester had called them ever gentle gods. Besides, thy best of rest is sleep, and that thou oft provokest, yet grossly fear'st thy death, which is no more than sleep. Sleep, perchance to dream. His spade struck against a stone. He stooped to pick it up, for in that sleep of death, what dreams? A humming overhead had become a roar, and suddenly he was in shadow. There was something between the sun and him. He looked up, startled from his digging, from his thoughts, looked up in a dazzled bewilderment, his mind still wandering in that other world of truer than truth, still focused on the immensities of death and deity. Looked up and saw, close above him, the swarm of hovering machines. Like locusts they came, hung poised, descended all around him on the heather, and from out of the bellies of these giant grasshoppers stepped men in white viscose flannels, women, for the weather was hot, in acetate shantung pajamas, or velveteen shorts and sleeveless, half-unzippered singlets. One couple from each. In a few minutes there were dozens of them, standing in a wide circle round the lighthouse, staring, laughing, clicking their cameras, throwing, as to an ape, peanuts, packets of sex-hormone chewing gum, panglandular petites bureaus, and every moment, or across the Hog's Back, the stream of traffic now flowed unceasingly. Their numbers increased. As in a nightmare, the dozens became scores, the scores hundreds. The savage had retreated towards cover, and now, in the posture of an animal at bay, stood with his back to the wall of the lighthouse, staring from face to face in speechless horror, like a man out of his senses. From this stupor he was aroused to a more immediate sense of reality by the impact on his cheek of a well-aimed packet of chewing gum. A shock of startling pain, and he was broad awake and fiercely angry. "Go away!" he shouted. The ape had spoken. There was a burst of laughter and hand-clapping. "Good old savage! Hurrah! Hurrah!" And through the babel he heard cries of, "Whip! Whip! The whip!" Acting on the word's suggestion, he seized the bunch of knotted cords from his nail behind the door and shook it at his tormentors. There was a yell of ironical applause. Menacingly, he advanced towards them. A woman cried out in fear. The line wavered at its most immediately threatened point, then stiffened again, stood firm. The consciousness of being an overwhelming force had given these sightseers a courage which the savage had not expected of them. Taken aback, he halted and looked round. "Why don't you leave me alone?" There was an almost plaintive note in his anger. "Have a few magnesium salted almonds," said the man who, if the savage were to advance, would be the first to be attacked. He held out a packet. "They're really very good, you know," he added with a rather nervous smile of propitiation. Is that one again? It's hard to say. With a rather nervous smile of propitiation. "And the magnesium salts will help keep you young." The savage ignored his offer. "What do you want with me?" he asked, turning from one grinning face to another. "What do you want with me?" "The whip," answered 100 voices confusedly. "Do the whipping stunt. Let's see the whipping stunt." Then, in unison, and on a slow, heavy rhythm, "We want the whip," shouted a group at the end of the line. "We want the whip." Others at once took up the cry, and the phrase was repeated, parrot fashion, again and again, with an ever-growing volume of sound, until by the 7th or 8th reiteration, no other word was being spoken. "We want the whip." They were all crying together, and intoxicated by the noise, the unanimity, the sense of rhythmic atonement, they might, it seemed, have gone on for hours, almost indefinitely. But at about the 25th repetition, the proceedings were startlingly interrupted. Yet another helicopter had arrived from across the Hog's Back, hung poised above the crowd, then dropped within a few yards of where the savage was standing, in the open space between the line of sightseers and the lighthouse. The roar of the air screws momentarily drowned the shouting. Then, as the machine touched the ground and the engines were turned off, "We want the whip! We want the whip!" broke out again in the same loud, insistent monotone. The door of the helicopter opened, and out stepped first a fair and ruddy-faced young man, in green velveteen shorts, white shirt, and a jockey cap, a young woman. At the sight of the young woman, the savage started, recoiled, turned pale. The young woman stood, smiling at him, an uncertain, imploring, almost abject smile. The seconds passed. His lips moved. She was saying something, but the sound of her voice was covered by the loud, reiterated refrain of the sightseers. "We want the whip! We want the whip!" The young woman pressed both hands to her left side, and on that peach-bright, dull, beautiful face of hers appeared a strangely incongruous expression of yearning distress. Her blue eyes seemed to grow larger, brighter, and suddenly 2 tears rolled down her cheeks. Inaudibly, she spoke again, then, with a quick, impassioned gesture, stretched out her arms towards the savage, stepped back. Jester stretched out her arms towards the savage, stepped forward. "We want the whip! We want—" And all of a sudden they had what they wanted. "Strumpet!" The savage just rushed at her like a madman. "Fichu!" Like a madman, he was slashing at her with a whip of small cords. Terrified, she had turned to flee, had tripped and fallen in the heather. "Henry! Henry!" she shouted, but her ruddy-faced companion had bolted out of harm's way behind the helicopter. With a whoop of delighted excitement, the line broke. There was a convergent stampede towards the magnetic center of attraction. Pain was a fascinating horror. Fry! Lechery! Fry! Frenzied, the savage slashed again. Hungrily they gathered round, pushing and scrambling like swine about the trough. On the flesh! The savage ground his teeth this time. It was on his shoulders that the whip descended. Kill it! Kill it! Drawn by the fascination of the horror of pain and from within, impelled by that habit of cooperation, that desire of unanimity and atonement which their conditioning had so ineradicably implanted in them, they began to mime the frenzy of his gestures, striking at one another as the savage struck at his own rebellious flesh, or at that plump incarnation of turpitude writhing in the heather at his feet. Kill it! Kill it! Kill it! The savage went on shouting. Then suddenly somebody started singing, Orgy Porgy, and in a moment they had all cut up the refrain, and singing, had begun to dance. Orgy Porgy, round and round and round, beating one another in 6/8 time. Orgy Porgy. It was after midnight when the last of the helicopters took its flight. Stupefied by soma and exhausted by a long-drawn frenzy of sensuality, the savage lay sleeping in the heather. The sun was already high when he awoke. He lay for a moment, blinking in owlish incomprehension at the light, then suddenly remembered everything. Oh, my God! My God! He covered his eyes with his hand. That evening the swarm of helicopters that came buzzing across the Hog's Back was a dark cloud 10 kilometers long. The description of last night's orgy of atonement had been in all the papers. Savage called the first arrivals, as they alighted from their machine. Mr. Savage! There was no answer. The door to the lighthouse was ajar. They pushed it open and walked into a shuttered twilight. Through an archway on the further side of the room, they could see the bottom of the staircase that led up to the higher floors. Just under the crown of the arch dangled a pair of feet. Mr. Savage! Slowly, very slowly, like 2 unhurried compass needles, the feet turned toward the right, north, northeast, east, southeast, south, south-southwest, then paused, and after a few seconds, turned as unhurriedly back towards the left, south-southwest, south, southeast, east. And there we have it. That is the end of A Brave New World. And sadly, John the Savage did not survive the tale. Well, I'm glad we finished this book. It's been a long time since I've read it, and I think it's a book that more people should read, especially if they're interested in dystopian fiction. And I'm glad you all come. I'm glad you can all show up at this episode. I'm still really, really, really fucking tired, so I think I'm gonna cut the stream after this, and then we will go ahead and pick up the next and final book for Dystopian December tomorrow. I'm gonna start reading 1984. It's a little bit smaller than I remember, so I should hopefully be able to just cram it in here before the end of the year. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Happy birthday again, Twitch. Thanks for sticking around. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Even though the end of the book is a little sad, I hope you have a very pleasant and happy birthday. All right, let's see who is online. Who can we raid? Who is online? Demencia's online, Plutonium's online, Darples is online, Happy, W. Kush, Rat Cousin. Let's see. Let's see if there's any other readers online, right? Reading. Será que a última palavra de Onyo? That's Portuguese. Any other English tubers? Fanfic. Time Writer. Oop. Yeah, let's just here. Let's following. Yeah, let's go ahead. I'm gonna go ahead and raid Rat Cousin. He's a lot bigger streamer than me. But it's a neat community. I've met some really cool people there. It's a funny group. So yeah, well, let's go ahead and start the raid there. We are unable to raid Rat Cousin at this time. Okay, I guess I can't raid Rat Cousin. In that case, let's raid. Oh shit, CC's on. CC's live. We're gonna raid CC. Raiding CC. Queen Muscle Mommy of Robot Land. Crimson Circuits, good friend of mine. She's always a sweet bean. I'm gonna go ahead and raid her. All right, there's a raid thing. I was gonna write a raid message the other day, and I totally got distracted for like 9 hours. So still no raid messages.